Today's lesson is about a controlled experiment. So when we're going over the scientific method, in order to test your hypothesis, you must do an experiment. Well, in science, it needs to be a controlled experiment, which means only one variable is changed, and it must contain the following components. So there's 4 of them. A control group, an independent variable, which is also known as a manipulated variable. So if you manipulate something, you're going to change. Dependent variable, they also call it a responding variable because this is like the effect of whatever your change is on your subject. So how is it going to respond? So how's the plant going to respond? You would look for like growth. And then constants. So we're going to be going through each of these 4 components in more detail. The first component in a controlled experiment is known as the control group. So the control group, it's part of your experiment that is not varied in any way. It's the normal or standard way. It's the group that is not getting the change. It's used as a standard of comparison. So for example, if you have 2 gardens and you're testing whether or not fertilizer will help the plants grow, the one garden that has no fertilizer, has nothing done to it, would be the control group. The next then component is known as constants. So these are things in the experiment that do not change. So usually you have what's called a control group and then the experimental groups, which are the ones that have everything done to it. Now, constants are found in the control group, but also these other experimental groups. So there are things in the experiment that don't change. They're kept exactly the same for each test group, so they do not affect the results. Now, within your experimental groups, so this is the part of the experiment that's getting the change done to it. There's 2 major types of variables. The independent variable or the manipulated variable, it's sometimes called. Sometimes you'll see in class we'll abbreviate it as IV for independent variable. This is the change or the difference that you're doing or making to the experiment. So it's the thing you're testing. So in my last example, I said we're testing whether or not fertilizer has an effect on the growth of plants. So the change would be the addition of fertilizer. So independent variable, it's whatever the experimenter is choosing to do to the experiment. What are they trying to change to the experiment? Now the dependent variable is also known as responding variable. You'll see it'll be abbreviated sometimes as DV in class. This is the difference that result from the experiment. So it's the resulting effect. So usually whatever data you're trying to collect in an experiment, that is the dependent variable. So anytime we're using plants as an example, you're going to see the dependent variable is always going to be like plant growth or height. All right, so let's do some examples of how to find the different variables. So again, IV is independent variable, DV is dependent variable. So again, the independent variable, I'm just going to put in parentheses here, is the change. So what is the experimenter changing? The dependent variable is the effect. So or the response. Okay, so for the first one, it says, an investigation found that more bushels of potatoes were produced when the soil was fertilized. So the experimenter has control over what changed. So in this case, it would be fertilizer. And then the dependent variable, how's it going to respond? Well, if you add fertilizer in this experiment, it's saying there's more bushels of potatoes. So I'm just going to write more potatoes. Okay, so the next one. Students measured the temperature of the water at different depths in Lake Skywalker and found that the temperatures varied. Okay, so what is the experimenter, what do they have control over? Well, they have control over the different depths because we can't control the temperature of the water then. So the independent variable would be the different depths of water. And then the effect on moving to the different depths would be what you're measuring, which is the temperature. So temperature change. Okay, the next one. It says the amount of pollution produced by cars was measured for cars using gasoline containing different amounts of lead. So what does the experimenter actually have control over changing? Do they have control over how much pollution the car is giving off? No, not really. But they do have control over the amount of lead that they put in the gasoline. So the amount of lead in the gasoline would be the independent variable, and then the dependent variable would be the amount of pollution. So we will do several of these examples in class together. Okay, so here's an example going through starting at the very beginning of the scientific method. So we're asking a question or we have a problem. So will adding fertilizer to the soil in my garden help me grow more tomatoes? So that's our question. So after your question, you then go into your research. So you're using prior knowledge and scientific research to answer the following questions. So we already know, like, in order to grow plants, you need water, you need sunlight, you need minerals in the soil. So those are all things. And then you can use your prior knowledge of what you do know about fertilizer. So normally fertilizer does help increase the production or growth of plants. So then you would form a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is always in an if-then statement. So for example, it could be, if I add fertilizer to my garden, then I will grow more tomatoes. So it's an if and then a then statement. So here's my setup of my controlled experiment. So remember, it's going to have to include 4 different components. So here's my garden 1, and then here's my garden 2. So if you're just looking at the 2 gardens, you can look, you see they both have the same type of tomato seeds. They're both getting watered the same time and amount. They have a similar type of soil. They're trying to control pests, but the only difference is that garden 1 doesn't have fertilizer and garden 2 has fertilizer. So remember, you always need to have a control group, independent variable, dependent variable, and then constants in your controlled experiment. So what would be the control group? So remember, control group is the normal standard of comparison, the garden that doesn't get the change to it. So if you look, the one that doesn't get the change to it would be garden 1. So then what is the independent variable? What is the change that's occurring? What does the experimenter have change control over? It would be the addition of fertilizer. So fertilizer would be the independent variable. So what are some constants? Well, if you look, remember, constants are in both control group and experimental groups. They're the things that are the same throughout. So there's several here. We're using the same type of tomato seed, brand A. We're watering the same. We have similar soil. We're trying to control pests. So those are all constants. The dependent variable, if the independent variable is the addition of fertilizer, then the dependent variable is how is the plant going to respond if they get fertilizer. So what is the data we're trying to collect? We're trying to see plant growth. Which garden is going to produce more tomatoes? So you can see all that's written down here for your guys to look at. Here's another example of identifying parts of a controlled experiment. So a student wanted to test how the mass of a paper airplane affected the distance it would fly. Paper clips were added before each test flight. As each paper clip was added, the plane was tested to determine how far it would fly. So a lot of the times, the easiest thing to identify first is the independent variable. So what is the change in this experiment? So the change would be the addition of paper clips or the mass of the paper airplane. So you could write down in your independent variable, you could say the paper clips, or adding paper clips is the independent variable. You could say the mass of the paper airplanes, the independent variable. So I'm just going to say mass of airplane. Okay, so then what is the effect of adding the paper clips to the airplane? Like, how are we testing the effect that these paper clips have on the airplane? We are looking for the distance. So the distance would be the dependent variable. So then what would the control group be? So it's used as a standard of comparison. It's like the normal way. It's how we're going to compare adding these paper clips to what paper airplane. It would be the original one with no paper clips on it. So we're just going to write here, airplane with no paper clips. Okay, so what are then some constants? So you want to think about what are things that would have to stay the same between a normal paper airplane with nothing on it versus an airplane that has now had paper clips added to it. So what would have to stay the same? Well, it would have to be the original airplane. So the paper airplanes have to be the same. So the paper airplane, like the construction of it, how it's made. Another thing that would have to stay the same would be like, how are we determining the distance of this flight? We're probably going to have to use a ruler, right? So the ruler is going to have to be the same throughout. Okay? So those are just two examples of constants. Hopefully you guys can think of a couple others. All right, here's another example. Homer notices that his shower is covered in a strange green slime. His friend Barney tells him that coconut juice will get rid of the green slime. Homer decides to check this out by spraying half the shower with coconut juice. He sprays the other half of the shower with water. After 3 days of treatment, there is no change in the appearance of the green slime on either side of the shower. So what's the independent variable? What's the change being done? It would be the coconut juice, because that's what he's changing. Now, the control group would be the normal way his shower is usually, like what type of liquid's usually on the shower. So that would be the one with water. So the shower with the water, shower side with water, because that's the normal standard way that he takes a shower, just with regular water. Now the dependent variable, so how is adding coconut juice to the shower, like how's the shower going to respond? Like what are we looking for? So what we're measuring here is still we're looking for the amount of green slime on the shower. So the amount of green slime, because that's how we're going to know whether or not the water or the coconut juice is going to make the shower cleaner. Now, some constants. So you can see here, there's already some listed. So the amount of times the same. So it was 3 days. Also, he's going to have to use the same amount. So the amount of coconut juice versus the amount of water. So the amount of liquid is going to have to be the same. I hope these examples were helpful. We're going to do many more in class together, but if you guys have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out and get some extra help.